Wyoming Territory, late spring of 1883, just past the thaw, when the land smelled of wet pine and old sorrow. Marshal Forrester was riding northeast toward Buffalo Gap when he spotted the woman kneeling in a patch of wild grass, her shoulders shaking under a pale blue dress, the wind tugging loose strands of her chestnut hair. She was alone, save for a wooden cross set crooked in the earth. The kind made in a hurry, the kind that marked someone loved and lost. He slowed his horse, dismounted, and walked the last few yards with his hat in hand. "Ma'am!" She turned her face quick, startled. Her cheeks were streaked with dust and tears. Her eyes locked on his with a kind of hollow, panicked grief. She looked young but not fragile. "Not anymore. I just buried my husband," she said. "2 days ago. Wolves got the mule last night. I was gonna try and walk to town. But then Her voice cracked. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Marshal crouched beside her, careful with the space between them. "My name's Marshal Forrester. Folks call me Mark." He glanced at the cross. "You got a name, ma'am?" "Willa Zeller." He nodded. "You got kin nearby?" She shook her head. "No one left. Just me now." Mark looked past her to the low remains of what must have been a home, a collapsed roof, a scorched beam, and the unmistakable black edges of fire. "What happened out here?" "Lightning storm caught the roof. My husband tried to put it out, but—" Her hands balled into fists. "He did not make it. I barely got out. Everything else gone." Mark looked at the cross again. It had been carved with care, even in her grief. There was no marker on it but the initials HZ. "I will not leave him alone," Willa whispered. "I do not care if the coyotes come for me next." Mark let out a breath and stood. "No one's leaving anyone behind," he said. "Come on. We will get you into town. I will help you bury him proper, and then—" "There is nothing left for me in town," she said sharply. "He and I built this place from nothing. We worked this land with our own hands. I am not running from it." Mark studied her a long moment. Her dress was torn at the hem, and one boot had a broken lace. But there was something fierce in the way she stood now, tall and dry-eyed, like the worst of the storm had already passed through her. He looked back at the burned homestead, then at the cross. "Then I will help you build again." Willa blinked. "Why would you do that?" "Because I have known what it is to lose everything," Mark said quietly. "And I know what it means to have someone help you remember how to stand." Willa turned her gaze back to the cross. The wind pushed her hair across her cheek, and she let it stay there. "I do not want pity," she said. "You will not get any from me," he said. "Just 2 hands and a hammer." She looked at him again, longer this time, then gave a single nod. That night, Mark made camp near the ashes of the house. Willa sat at the edge of the firelight, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the flames. She did not speak much, and he did not press her. Sometimes silence was the only thing that fit. By morning, she had pulled her hair back and rolled up her sleeves. "If you are going to help me," she said, "you better know how to swing a saw." Mark grinned. "I do all right." They began with the land clearing the charred timber, marking off what could be salvaged. Willa had a mind for measurements and a stubborn streak that made her work past dusk. She did not complain. She did not cry again. But every now and then, Mark would catch her looking toward the cross. A few days in, he brought her to town for supplies. Folks stared. A few whispered. Everyone had heard about the fire. At the general store, Willa stood stiff, her chin high as she listed off lumber sizes and seed needs. Mark kept close, not touching, but steady. When a man made a crude remark near the door, Mark stepped between them fast as a snake. "You got something to say, you say it to me." The man backed off, muttering. Willa did not thank Mark out loud, but she walked closer to him after that. Back at the homestead, She worked with more focus. They built the frame of a new cabin within 2 weeks. It was not much, just walls and a roof for now, but it stood like something proud. One evening, Mark found her standing just outside the house, staring at the cross again. "I have not told you his name," she said. Mark waited. "Henry. We met when we were 17, married a year after. He was all I ever knew." "I understand," Mark said. She looked at him. "Did you lose someone?" He nodded. "My brother. During the war. I was 15 when he left. I never saw him again." She exhaled slowly. "You carry it different. No one carries it the same." She stepped toward him, just one pace. "You have been kind to me, Mark. I do not know what I would have done if you had not come by that day." He looked at her, the way the firelight caught the edge of her jaw, the tired but steady strength in her eyes. "You still would have stood up," he said. "Maybe not that day, but you would have found your feet." Willa swallowed hard. "Maybe, but I am glad I did not have to do it alone." He did not answer. He just reached out and rested his hand lightly on hers. She did not pull away. By early June, the new walls stood 2 logs taller than Willa's shoulder, their seams packed with moss and clay she'd gathered near the creek bed. The cabin had begun to take on a shape that felt less like a shelter and more like a home. Mark had driven nails through his gloves more than once, but she never teased him for it. She only handed him another board or held the ladder steady, her hands calloused and steady as his own. One morning, she brought out a folded piece of cloth and unwrapped it across the sawhorse. Inside were a few carefully saved nails, a small tin of lard, and a hand-drawn sketch of a table. "Henry and I meant to build this once the planting took hold," she said, brushing her thumb along the edge of the paper. "I found the drawing in a trunk that didn't burn." Mark studied it. The lines were simple, but the proportions showed a careful eye. "You want to finish it?" "I want it in the house when the roof's on." He nodded. "We'll start with the legs. That pine from the east ridge is dry enough now." They worked side by side, measuring and sawing in rhythm. Willa didn't hum or fill the air with talk, but her movements grew lighter with the task. She sanded the edges until they were smooth to the touch, her brow furrowed in quiet purpose. Later, after supper, she sat on the cabin's threshold and watched the last of the light fade behind the hills. Mark joined her, setting down a tin cup of water beside her. "Did you ever think about settling down?" she asked, not looking at him. "I used to," he said. "Before the war ended, I thought I might take over my uncle's pasture near Fort Laramie. But things changed. I got called elsewhere. Never found a reason to stay long enough anywhere." She turned her head, eyes heavy with something unreadable. "You've stayed a while here. Seems like you needed someone to carry lumber." "There are plenty of men in Buffalo Gap who can carry lumber." He didn't answer right away. The quiet stretched between them, easy but taut. "I stayed because I wanted to," he said finally. She studied him, then looked down at her hands. "I don't know what I am anymore without him. What kind of person I'll become. Maybe that's something you don't have to figure out all at once." She nodded slowly, and the wind caught strands of her hair again, brushing them across her cheek. Mark resisted the urge to reach out. The next day, she took him up the ridge trail behind the property, where the view opened to a wide span of meadow and distant Blue Ridge. She carried a small tin box with her, and when they reached the overlook, she knelt and opened it. Inside were 3 folded letters and a braided strip of leather. "He wore this on his hatband," she said, placing it on a flat stone. "And he wrote me before the fire. I couldn't bring myself to read them until now." Mark stood back, silent. She opened the first letter, lips moving soundlessly as she read. When she finished, she placed it back in the tin and closed it. "I thought it would hurt worse," she said, standing. "But it didn't." He said he wanted me to live. That if anything ever happened, I should keep going. Mark held her gaze. You are. I think I am, she whispered. He offered his arm on the walk down. She took it, her grip firm and warm. They finished the table that week. The roof went up the next. And when the last board was nailed, Willa stepped back and placed her hand to the frame. It's not what we planned, she said. But it's mine now. Ours, Mark said. She looked at him then, not startled, not uncertain, just steady. Yes, she said. Ours. The first rain came soft and steady, the kind that tapped gently on the roof Willa and Mark had raised with their own hands. It soaked into the soil around the new planting rows beans, squash, and late corn while the smell of wet cedar drifted through the open shutters. Willa sat at the finished table, a half-sewn curtain folded across her lap, needle paused mid-stitch. Mark was oiling the hinges on the doorframe, quiet in his work. She watched him a moment before speaking. I've been thinking about selling eggs. He didn't look up. You planning on keeping chickens? There's an old coop near the tree line. The frame's still good. I could mend the fencing and trade with Mrs. Callahan for pullets next week. Mark leaned back, wiping his hands on a cloth. You've already figured the whole thing, haven't you? I've been alone before, she said. Not like this, but I know how to keep things running. He stood, setting the oil tin aside. You're not alone now. Willa met his eyes. I know that. She returned to her stitching, pulling the thread through the fabric with even pressure. The silence settled again, warm and unforced. That afternoon, Mark rode to the far edge of her land to fell a downed cottonwood. He returned with a fresh scrape across his forearm and a pair of limbs long enough for bedposts. When Willa saw the wood, her brow lifted. You planning to sleep on the floor until winter? He set the timber down just inside the doorway. No. Figured I'd build something proper. You've got a house now. I ought to have something more than a blanket in the corner. She folded the curtain and stood. You could move the cot inside. I could. You don't want to? He rubbed the back of his neck. Doesn't feel right. Not without asking. Willa stepped closer. Then ask. Mark's voice was quiet. May I stay? She didn't hesitate. Yes. Later. She watched him from the window as he stripped bark from the cottonwood. His shirt was damp with sweat, and his movements were steady, practiced like the work kept his thoughts in place. She turned back to her sewing, but this time her hands moved slower, more thoughtful. That night, they shared stew from the same pot, each taking turns with the ladle. Afterward, Willa lit a single candle and brought it to the table. Mark sat across from her, arms folded loosely, watching her face in the flickering light. I used to wonder, she said, if I'd ever feel anything but hollow again. He didn't speak. But I'm starting to think grief doesn't take everything. It leaves behind what matters most. What's that, Willa? Kindness, she said, and room for something new. The candlelight danced in her eyes as she looked at him. I never expected you. But I'm glad you came by that day. Mark leaned forward, his voice low. I didn't come looking for anything. I know. But I found something anyway. Her hand reached across the table, palm up. He placed his over hers without a word. Outside, the rain had stopped. The land, for the first time in weeks, felt still. Not empty, just waiting. Willa folded their joined hands in her lap. Tomorrow, I'll start mending the coop. I'll hitch the wagon. We'll pick up feed and fencing in town. She nodded, leaning slightly closer. You think we'll make it out here? We already are. The morning sun crept slow across the eastern ridge, casting long amber stripes over the clearing. Willa stood beside the coop, sleeves rolled up, a coil of fencing wire slung over one shoulder. Mark crouched by the corner post, driving a spike deep into the soil with the back of his axe. "Fence'll hold," he said, checking the tension. "But you'll have to watch for foxes come summer." Willa nodded, unwinding the wire. "I'll set traps near the tree line. There's bait still in the root cellar." Mark stood, brushing dirt from his palms. "You think you'll want more than chickens eventually?" She stepped back to study the line they'd strung. "Maybe a milk cow, if the grass stays good. I want to make butter before the first frost." "You plan like someone who means to stay." She glanced at him. "I do." They spent most of the day hauling planks to patch the roof of the coop. Willa worked the hammer with short, precise strikes. Mark passed her nails without needing to be asked. The rhythm between them had grown quiet and easy, like a song neither had to speak aloud. Around mid-afternoon, as they paused for water beneath the cottonwood, Willa shifted her weight and looked toward the ridge. "I've been thinking about the creek," she said. "There's a bend near the sycamore where the ground's flat. It'd be good for a garden come next spring." "You want to expand?" She nodded. "I want to try tomatoes, maybe onions. If we can dig a trench, we could run water from the stream." Mark leaned his shoulder against the trunk. "You already see next year, clear as a map." "I have to," she said. "If I don't keep looking forward, I'll lose my footing." He watched her a moment, the way her hands wrapped tight around the tin cup, knuckles pale. "What did you used to want before all this?" She hesitated. "I thought we'd have children. I used to picture a little boy, dark-haired like Henry, helping with the corn, laughing in the dirt." Mark didn't interrupt. "I still see him sometimes," she went on. "Not always clear, but I think he stays with me. The wanting." Mark's voice was low. "There's nothing wrong in wanting still." She looked at him, her face unreadable. "What about you?" "I never thought much past the next job," he said. "But now I think about horses in the field, smoke from a chimney, a warm table after dark." She said nothing, but her gaze didn't leave his. That evening, as the last light faded, Mark unrolled a length of canvas across the barn floor and began fitting the bedposts together. Willa knelt beside him, holding the joints steady while he tightened the pegs. "You'll need a mattress," she said. "I was going to trade for ticking and straw next week. I can sew a cover if you bring the fabric." His hands paused. "You'd do that for me?" "I'm not doing it for you," she said. "I'm doing it because I don't want you waking up sore and limping through chores." He grinned. "Duly noted." When the frame stood upright, Willa stepped back and folded her arms. "It looks like it belongs here." Mark met her eyes. "So do I." She didn't look away. "I know." They stood facing each other in the hush of the barn, the scent of dry hay and cedar between them. Outside, wind stirred the grass in steady waves. Mark reached out, not rushed, just sure. His hand found hers, and she let it. "Whatever comes," he said, "I'm here." Willa's voice was quiet. "I want that." And they stood there, hand in hand, the weight of the past behind them and the shape of something new settling gently into place. The first frost settled late that year. By mid-October, the edges of the pasture gleamed white at dawn, and the horse's breath came in slow clouds. Mark rose early to split kindling while Willa patched the last of the wool blankets by lantern light. The cabin held warmth now, not just from the stove, but from the rhythm of two lives stitched carefully together. One morning, Willa opened the door to find a basket resting at the step. Inside were 2 hens, a jar of lard, and a folded note in Mrs. Callahan's handwriting offering goodwill and a quiet acknowledgement of Willa's return to the world. No words were exchanged when they next crossed paths in town, but Mrs. Callahan gave her a nod, and Willa returned it without hesitation. That afternoon, Willa stood beside the coop, watching the hens scratch at the dirt, then turned to Mark. who was mending the harness straps beneath the lean-to. "You ever think about what it'd be like to raise young ones here?" she asked. He let the leather fall across his lap. "I have." She stepped closer, her boots brushing the dry grass. "I wouldn't want to do it alone." "You wouldn't." A late wind stirred the trees behind them. She waited a breath before speaking again. "I never imagined wanting this again, but I do." Mark stood and wiped his hands on a rag. "Then let's build it together. Whatever comes." They married at the creek bend 2 weeks later, just before the leaves turned. No preacher, no witnesses but the trees and the sky. Willa wore a wool shawl embroidered with faded thread and tied her hair with a ribbon that had survived the fire. Mark carved 2 rings from cottonwood, smoothed and polished with beeswax. She slid one onto his hand herself, steady and sure. "I never thought I'd say vows again," she said, voice quiet. "I never thought I'd find reason for them," he answered. That night, they sat by the fire, knees touching, the cabin drawn close around them with the scent of pine smoke in the air. Mark reached behind the hearthstone and pulled out a small wooden box. "I've had this tucked away since before the roof was finished," he said. Inside lay a set of inked land papers, marked with both their names. "You claimed the deed?" Willa asked, breath-catching. "Made it official. It's yours as much as mine. Always was." She traced her name, her fingers trembling just slightly. "No one's ever written it down like that before." Mark reached for her hand. "Now they will." Winter came early. Snow pressed thick against the shutters, and they moved through the days with slow purpose. Mark carved a cradle from leftover pine, fitting it together with care. Willa lined it with quilted scraps from a dress she'd outgrown. In February, Willa felt the first stirrings inside her belly. She pressed Mark's hand to it one night, his fingers wide and still against her skin. Neither of them spoke, but his eyes shone with something quiet and full. By spring, the cradle stood ready near the hearth, and the coop bustled with fresh chicks. The garden rows stretched neat and waiting, and Willa moved slower with her growing belly, but still with that same unshaken forward gaze. On a warm morning in May, she gave birth to a daughter with dark hair and long fingers who cried like thunder and slept like stone. They named her Clara, after the ridge where the cottonwoods met the sky. Willa rocked her in the chair Mark had built, singing lullabies no one had heard in years. Mark watched from the doorway, arms folded, the sun catching the edge of his jaw, the baby's cries quieting at the sound of Willa's voice. They grew into the land together. Days turned to seasons and seasons to years. Mark taught Clara to ride, and Willa taught her to plant. They spoke often beneath the trees where they'd married, and sometimes left small stones at Henry's Cross when the wind changed. No part of Willa's past was erased, but it folded gently into the life she'd made anew. Mark never tried to replace what had been lost. He only stood beside her, steady as the ridge, until love became not a question, but a fact lived each day. And so they stayed through snow and bloom, through birth and quiet joy in the house they built with their own hands, where love took root again and grew strong as cedar. They never left. They never needed to.